Hey everyone, welcome back to Generation Cult, a podcast about people who grew up in isolated authoritarian groups, also called cults, and how they adjusted to the rest of the world after they left their groups. I'm Dhyana Levy, your host, and today we're going to be speaking with Emily, who was raised along with her 6 siblings on a secluded farm by parents focused on preparing for the end times. Also with me today is Ashlen Hilliard, who will be coming in again at the end to participate in the discussion. Hi, Ashlen.
Hello. Thanks for having me on once again. I'm excited to be here.
Great. Yeah, thanks for being here. Great to have you. I think Emily's story is a great example of something people refer to as a family cult. It's not your traditional large group organization, it's a family, but the methods used to control and isolate its members are similar to any other group of concern out there. What do you think?
Yeah, so when it comes to coercive control, that can certainly exist on one relationships or within family systems, and it can certainly parallel how coercive control is enacted in a cultic environment. So, certainly, families can function like cults. Unfortunately, individuals healing from dysfunctional families, especially if they may have some narcissistic parents, may find that they share much in common with those who've left cults depending on the situation. This is something that is becoming much more recognized in the cult recovery field, thanks to a deeper understanding of coercive control across many domains.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to thank you, Emily, for contributing to these discussions. You're certainly seen in these spaces, and your story is really important.
Thank you. Thank you. That means a lot to me, actually. You're going to make me cry because I have felt very lost in that definition. So hearing you say that is very validating.
Yeah, I'm happy to hear. You certainly belong in these discussions. And even within a more academic framing, dysfunctional families may operate cult like, and they're starting to gain a lot of traction with that, even from a more academic research perspective. So you're welcome here.
Yeah,
Thank
definitely.
you.
Glad to have you. And before we jump into the interview, I'm going to take a quick moment to let everyone know, if they didn't know already, that Generation Cult now has a Patreon page. So if you like the show and you want to support it, please find Generation Cult on the Patreon website. You can sign up at the $2, $5, $10, or even $25 a month level. And you can also access some bonus features. Okay, so let's jump into the interview. Emily, as we said before, we're so happy to have you with us and that you're willing to tell your story.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for taking the time today.
Oh, of course, my pleasure. So tell me about where you grew up.
So I grew up in Oklahoma, pretty close to Oklahoma City, but it was far enough away to where we were on a pretty secluded farm. I would say our closest neighbor was probably 3 miles away, maybe 4. But being a kid, that probably could be over exaggerated. You know, everything's a lot bigger when you're young. My father worked in the city, so he drove his car there, and the children and my mother, we all stayed on the farm for a good 8 to 10 years in that little secluded area with animals and gardens and just ourselves.
Oh, and how many siblings do you have?
There are a total of 7 of us.
So at what point did you end up moving to the Pacific Northwest?
We moved, gosh, I forget the year. I want to say I was 9 years old when we got up here. And we moved because my brother was born with a multitude of different diagnoses and heart issues. And we came up here to Washington because my mom had found that one of the best heart surgeons in the nations was here. And we moved our whole family. And we already had extended family up here anyways, so the ducks were just lining up to where it made sense that we should be moving up here. And that happened when I was 9, and we've been here ever since.
So I guess this question applies to both farms that you were on. How isolated were they?
That's a good question. For the first one, I would say almost complete isolation for the first 10 years of my life. We would have the occasional customer from my mom's business she was running, and we would have a couple friends maybe from their small groups every once in a while, but that was few and far between as my parents didn't really have many relationships in that area. So pretty secluded on the first one. And then the second one was kind of a wave of socializing, definitely almost no isolation on the next one.
So the second one, the one in Washington State
Mhm.
that you moved out of, was a little less isolated, or a lot less isolated than the one in
A lot
Oklahoma.
less isolated.
Okay.
Yes, I would say most of the isolation was, in the first house.
And so talk to me about why you were isolated and your parents' belief, if there's a simple way to start into that.
Right. Can of worms for sure. So my parents believed that the world was ending at some point. For a long time they didn't know when that would be. They just knew that we needed to prepare our hearts, our souls, and do all that we can on this earth to prepare for their children. And part of that was, teaching them survival skills. It was teaching them how to build a fire. It was teaching them how to milk a cow and tend the garden, and even things like knowing which plants to eat out in the wild. And I remember on multiple occasions we'd go on these field trips for, that substituted in our homeschooling. We didn't really do education as far as the traditional sense. So we would go on these nature walks. We would learn everything on the farm, and most of it was geared towards the end of the world that was going to happen. Or some people call it the rapture. Some people are calling it God's son returns. There's a couple ways I think people have labeled this event that should be happening. And eventually, my parents came up with the date of 2012. Somewhere, I want to say it was in the spring at some point.
So 2012 was the focus. I believe that's the end of the Mayan calendar. I remember 2012 being a date. I think there was even a movie, 2012.
Yes, yes, you're correct on both.
Okay, so 2012 passes and nothing happens. What was your parents' reaction to that?
So it was honestly a difficult thing for all of us as children, because it was the center of our life for all of our lives, and all of our education, all of our family bonding. Everything was centered around this end of the world happening, and that was the only thing that I really had to grip onto. And so when this date didn't happen, my dad tried to brush it off and say, "Oh, maybe I got the dates wrong, and let's go back to the numbers and see if we can figure this out." And him and my mom talked for a while, and they came back and said something along the lines of, "It's next year or 2 years away," and eventually it just started to fizzle out. It wasn't really a quick cutoff. They, would mention things here and there of the end of the world still happening, and then it just kind of fizzled out. My mom kind of went inward. My dad kind of continued on that research, but could tell that my mother was extremely angry about how it had affected our lives. And so I think my dad was punished to be in the corner, and my mom punished herself to hide away from that shame. And now I would say all throughout my teenage years, up until maybe the year I moved out, nothing really was talked about after that. And so for me, it was almost surreal having the first half of my life be preparing for this event, and the second half being, well, is this even real? No one's talking about it. It's not a thing anymore. And it wasn't until very recently, like about the time the pandemic started, that they brought it back up and started to really dive back into that belief system.
So is there a date now that they're thinking it'll happen?
They just keep saying soon, I think because my mom was burned so badly with being wrong and not having the actual date. She is very much, what's the word? She's making it so that my father doesn't feel the comfort to actually say the legit date out loud. That one verse that says something along the lines of no man knows the day or the hour. So she brings that up constantly, and I think now they're just sometime in the future, an arbitrary date that we don't know and we can't know. So it's going to happen and you'll all see kind of
Mm.
attitude.
So that's what they still believe.
Yes.
And this belief is tied to a faith, right? Were you raised Christian fundamentalist? Is that a correct way to describe the religion you were raised with? Or tell me about it.
I wish I had more labels and more ways to, I guess, give a name to all of this. I know the theology that we were taught and these end of the world beliefs, they don't necessarily line up. One did not cause the other. And there haven't really been spaces made in my family to where I can dive into that and really talk about it. But we did start our religion on the praise house side of things. I sent you that article
Yes.
and a couple things with that. That one, it's an interesting thing because that sect of the religion really is the opposite of, I would say, their end of the world thinking almost. Like, yes, I do think that they have some of that sprinkled in there, but it seems to be that most of the religion is having a beautiful relationship with God, having such a love for God that you have to sing it out. And I thought that that was the most beautiful thing about that religion, but I've been diving in since you asked me the questions. I don't know where it came from, this dramatic and steadfast belief that the world was going to end in 2012. For the life of me, I've asked people in my life, and an old babysitter I had in Oklahoma who had also been in that church. I asked all of them, and no one really knows what happened to my parents or how they got to that point, almost to the point of crazy people, you know?
Having a label or words to attach to something can be really helpful in understanding. I guess I'm trying to do it too, trying to rationalize it by by
Right.
reaching back and yeah, by asking you about this. So before they attended something called the Praise House, which I believe you mentioned your grandmother was into.
Yes. And my grandma grew up in that kind of a church, and then she passed that theology on to her children, which would be my dad. And from there, that was the type of religion, Christianity, the relationship with God, that was what was that was based around. And my dad, I would say, is extremely religious. My mom, not so much.
Hmm. Okay,
Yeah.
well, give me a better idea about what life was like. You said in the beginning, and this is when you were in Oklahoma, you were on a farm with all your siblings and you were really isolated. So, give me an idea of some of your first memories from that time.
Man, some of my first memories, I do remember as maybe 3 or 4 years old, running through the long grass and the fields and playing with the animals. It was, I keep using this word, but it was pretty surreal being a kid, almost like I was in my own movie. Nobody else was there except for the people in my movie.
That was your family, basically.
That was my yeah, that was my family. They were all cast members in this story with me, and it was, looking back on it, it's sad for sure, but at the time, it was a beautiful thing. Sorry, I'm getting choked up and I'm trying to breathe.
Oh, okay. No, that's fine. If you need to take a moment, that's totally cool. Good. Well, what I'm basically trying to get an idea of is what was it like growing up in a house that was constantly preparing for the end times? I guess I'm curious about what your house looked like, what you and
Mhm.
your siblings did. I'm really curious to hear about, now looking back, the type of isolation. I feel like that's a huge part of something that must have
Right.
affected you as a kid. So, if you can think of any memories, anything that kind of set your family apart from other families,
Mhm.
due to this belief.
Well, in the house, it was mainly just getting your heart right with God. There wasn't much end of the world prepping until, I would say, we moved up here to Washington. Most of it was just the belief and teaching the children and getting our heart rights with God. So it was mainly just like I had said before, the nature walks and the learning survival skills on the farm with my parents and learning how to take care of the children. As far as the isolation, that was it, was just being on that farm and being with each other and circulating those beliefs around and around for the next 10 years.
Yeah.
As far as physical preparation, we definitely had our survival packs packed, and we would switch them out every year and make sure that everything was up to date. And, mom would test us with how to make a fire and quiz us on things like, what happens if you see this kind of plant? What do you do to help it with the bitterness? How can you use this plant for first aid kind of things? And I think the only actual academic that I had learned at that point was reading, and I taught reading to the rest of the kids. So that was the majority of what was taught in Oklahoma.
And about how old were you during this time?
I was between 3 and 9 years old,
Okay.
I would say. All in between there was that time. We did not go to school. My mom had tried to get us involved in one of these hardcore wilderness homeschool groups, and we tried for a while, but my mom, as you'll tend to see the pattern throughout the stories I'm telling you, she's not good at making relationships with people. And I think half of the isolation was not wanting to have anybody influence their kids, but the other half was not being able to make connections with people, long lasting, deeper connections. And so they tried that homeschooling group for a couple weeks, I think, but other than that, it was almost complete isolation because of those two factors.
Did things change once you moved to Washington?
Absolutely, almost a 180. At this point, it was more of a mental isolation instead of a physical one. I don't know if that's even the right way to say this.
Yeah, that sounds legit. You're around what, 10 years old around this time? 9,
Yep.
10, you guys have moved. So yeah, tell me about this emotional isolation. What makes you call it that?
I would say because my mom still had us homeschooling and was very adamant on that, and friends were very much discouraged. In fact, I remember a specific line. My parents said, "You don't need friends. Friends will just hurt you in the end." And something, I know my dad always pulled up this verse about family being forever and bringing your family to heaven with you, and all that to say, friends were very much discouraged. And any time we brought one over, that was not encouraged, but it was almost unavoidable too, because we had neighbors that were right next to us, and the whole neighborhood was filled with kids. And so we were allowed to bring people over, but no one really knew the lives that we were leading behind closed doors, which when we moved up here, and like I said, my brother had a lot of health issues. And I think that this child is what caused my mother to almost spiral inside of herself and grip harder to this theology and this end of the world thinking, because now she has the most helpless being in her arms, and she wants him to have not only the best life possible, but to come to heaven with us when all of this ends. And so I think both of my parents at that point just really gripped on to making your heart right with God and making sure everybody believed that Jesus died for your sins, and if that's the case, then you're going to heaven. And so I think what sent my mom down that crazy spiral was that my littlest brother he wasn't verbal. He has mental challenges to where he cannot communicate with us, and I think that scared her, and scared her that he wouldn't be going to heaven because he couldn't declare that out loud. And so what happened behind closed doors was, I don't know, it was like back in Oklahoma, but almost as if it was turning poisonous. It was eating them from the inside. It was eating their marriage from the inside.
Were they fighting a lot?
They were. Yeah.
And was it disagreements over what was going to happen about the world's end, or was it just disagreements about like day to day house stuff?
It was more day to day. My dad made it clear that it was going to happen on this day. And so I guess what I meant by all that was, on the outside, we'd play with a few kids and it looked all happy. But on the inside, when we closed our doors, there was lots of fighting between my parents on, how should we raise these kids and how should we teach this to where they are for sure getting that golden ticket to heaven, when in 3 years when this event happens. And I think that that's part of what caused so much stress during that time. And my mom really, really focused on the survival skills at that point. And I think because she was so focused on the figuring out how to take care of everybody and my brother, and my dad was focused on, all right, let's get the date set. Let's make sure everybody's heart right with Jesus. We don't have time to give the rest of the kids necessarily what they need. So that's when they sent me to school.
Oh, okay. So you did end up going to a public school at some point.
Yes. And this was at 13.
So you mentioned that they thought the world was going to end in a few years. Was this kind of leading up to 2012, or was this after that?
This was leading up to, so that was my math I was doing in my head. The year they sent me to school was a year before 2012.
Okay. And you were in Washington. Okay. And then, not to keep trying to rationalize it, You mentioned when we spoke earlier that part of their belief system kind of stemmed from them not trusting the government. Tell me about that. How was that communicated?
So, being the child in this relationship, I feel bad because I don't have as much information as I would like more information too, but I don't feel like I have enough being the child in that time, you know? So, what was relayed to me may not have been relayed between the adults, and being so isolated, I don't necessarily have anybody other than my parents to go ask these questions to. So, as far as the government and everything, they would only bring up those beliefs when we would ask them, such as, why can't I go to school? Why can't I have friends? Why can't we go get my broken arm fixed at the doctor? Other neighborhood kids are doing this. Their parents take them to the doctor. Why can't I go? And that's when we would get the floodgates opened of conspiracies and, well, don't you know that they're putting this in our water and they are trying to mind control our children and they're trying to pay doctors exorbitant amount of monies to put pills down our throats and, the same jargon that you hear in common conspiracies nowadays, you know?
Wow. So you weren't even able to see the doctor. Did you actually have a broken arm that wasn't treated?
Yes, and I was funny, I was just telling my husband this story the other day, but this one hit me hard was I broke my wrist when I was, gosh, I want to say I was 10, right when we got here. And they didn't believe me. I was screaming in pain and it was swelling for probably 3 or 4 days and I kept telling them it hurts, please take me to the doctor and they were not for it. My mom had this probably one of those brace things that she tried to put on me, and if it hadn't been for my aunt to come visit us, I don't think I would have gotten that fixed because my aunt, my father's sister, came and visited us. She dropped her kids off because her children, my cousins, were the same age as us. And she saw my arm twice its size and said, "What are you doing? Take that child to the hospital." And I remember them fighting about it for a couple hours, but she knew I needed it. And I was able to get a cast finally, but it took a lot of fighting on my aunt's side, I think.
Wow. Wow. So what about the rest of your siblings? You mentioned that your brother had some development and health problems. It sounds like they did see a doctor for him.
Yes.
So it had to basically reach a certain point for them to, it sounds like, to go see the doctor.
Yes. If you can see the pattern here, they grip onto their beliefs so hard until the last moment when they have to let go with the schooling. They let me into school finally after not knowing how to teach me things. They finally let me go to the doctor. And then with my youngest brother, that was something they couldn't hold on to. If they waited days like they had for me, he would have died. And they knew this, and I think I can't really tell you what was going on in their heads or how difficult it was for them to give up those beliefs, but I feel like, based on the patterns that I had seen throughout the years, that was probably a difficult decision for them to finally decide, okay, we're going to put our most delicate child in the hands of a doctor whom we've never let any of our other children.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
I feel like that was probably really difficult for them.
sure. And are you the oldest?
I am. Technically, I have a half brother, but he wasn't really involved with a lot of this, so
Okay. So just curious, I guess, about the rest of your siblings. Was it the same for them? Were they relatively healthy but didn't go to the doctor?
I would actually say we were all pretty healthy, aside from the occasional scrape and bruise, but internally, my mother was actually, I'll give her credit for this. She was really good at, would it be called homeopathy?
Yeah,
Probably.
maybe.
So I do think that there's some truth in a couple of those things. She definitely was able to give us first aid and taught herself a lot medically on the natural side of things. And as far as our nutrition and everything, my mother made all of us eat so healthy. So most of us were in pretty good health all of the time. The only exception was the youngest brother who had all of his heart difficulties and his mental difficulties. And the sister right below me had scoliosis and was diagnosed probably, gosh, I want to say a year after the 2012 date
Mm.
happened. When the 2012 date was over, that's when we all started to integrate a little bit more, bit by bit, into society. So at that point, she was able to get the medical needs met,
Mm.
which is good. But
Yeah.
as far as any other sprains or physical injuries, we're all taken care of at home. And internal health was maintained pretty well, I would say.
And what about vaccinations? I assume you guys didn't grow up getting your vaccinations?
No, actually, so I was born in California right before we moved to Oklahoma. And at that point, my mom and dad were still, they weren't in this theology yet, as far as I can tell in the history. So I was a normal kid from the age 1 to 2. I got all my shots, I got
Hmm.
all the things. And then we moved to Oklahoma, and that's when they isolated. And every kid after that, no vaccines, no nothing. My sister currently is trying to get caught up with all of that still now that she's moved out.
Hmm. Okay. So what were you thinking during this time? Like, at some point during all this, you realized that this wasn't the way other people were living. Like, at what point did that occur to you?
You know, I think it started to occur my first year of school.
And when was that? Like,
Um,
what grade?
that was at 13, so
Okay.
that would be grade 7, and that was a year before the 2012 event.
Okay. So you were able to go interact with other kids your age and realize that.
Yes, and oh my gosh, what an absolute slap to the face, just reality setting in, because like I had said, it was so surreal being in that movie all my life, and then going into school, and you know how kids are, you know how
Oh
middle
my
school
God.
kids are.
Yes.
Oh my goodness. So I did try my best to just be quiet most of the time and take in a lot of what I was seeing, this new movie that I was put into. And I think just hearing how different the beliefs other kids had and how different from even each other, it made me go, wow, everybody else seems to have different beliefs even from the classmate next to them, and they aren't upset at each other. They aren't ostracizing people or telling them that they are wrong. Like, people are just like, "Oh yeah, I'm a Baptist. Oh yeah, I'm Catholic." And that's okay. That's No one has a problem with this. Okay, I guess we're moving on and learning about social studies.
Was that comforting in a way, or was it just so foreign that?
It was foreign. I don't think it was comforting until a lot later, but it wasn't uncomfortable either. It was just something new and unreal to me. But I guess it didn't necessarily make me question my belief. It more just made me. It kind of cemented the ideas that my parents said, being of the world instead of being a part of God's world. That one verse that says, "Live our lives not of the world, but live it for God, and let God live through you."
So that kind of made that kind of solidified something for you?
Yeah, it kind of solidified that these people were just of the world and they're okay with each other's debauchery, or I don't know, because nobody was making such a fuss about the different theologies like my parents had. I just chalked that up to, oh, this is just more bigotry, like they said. This is more people just being okay with being of the world, and
Mm.
they don't know, but they're wrong, and they're comforted in their wrongness, and I'm comforted in the fact that I get to go to heaven and these other kids
Mm.
don't.
Mhm. Yeah.
So, especially bringing that home and telling my parents, and then they would keep cementing and keep circulating that theology, and everything I brought home was chalked up to that. So, I would say it was probably a part of maybe coercion, or almost mind control or brainwashing. Sounds really it sounds like a lot. I don't know if it would be considered that, but basically going to school, hearing these things, coming back, telling my parents, and they would chalk it up to working towards the theology and the things that they wanted to teach us. And eventually I got to the point where I wouldn't need to bring it home. I just got to that line of thinking myself. And so
Mm.
it ended up circulating in my own brain that way, to the point where I probably looked like some crazy end of the world person by the time I reached high school. But
Yeah, I was wondering how much you believed at that point. Were you still all in on, your parents' beliefs, or were you affected in any way by being around these other kids?
it wasn't an option.
Mm.
I didn't know that there was an option. It was that just how it was. I didn't know. I guess, looking back, it makes sense because they would say you have to believe that God did this for you, but I was never given a choice. And so for me, that was just how it was. That was the truth of it, and these other people are wrong.
Mm.
I guess it just made me question, or at least show me that people have choices. And that was something that was foreign to me for sure.
Mm.
Hello, listeners. My name is Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast. a long-format interview-based show that focuses on cults, high-demand groups, captive organisations and more. Each week, I interview a different cult survivor who brings a story of coercion and exploitation along with their own fight for freedom. With nearly 200 survivor interviews from all over the world, you can also find deep dives into infamous cults, interviews with leading experts in the field, and understand more about how cults exist all around us, and none of us are safe. Each month, I feature a different author on the show who has penned a compelling memoir about their cult experiences, which we discuss at length on the show, with copies of their books available to listeners. You will never be short of insightful and moving content here at the Cult Vault podcast, available on all major platforms.
So how did this affect you at school? Like, did you have a hard time talking to the other kids, or did it not bother you? Like, how did you feel, I guess, socially?
I remember bringing it up once or twice, like my religion and the way my family was. And I just remember being very embarrassed by the way that some children had acted in response to saying that. And granted, I didn't go into all the detail or anything, just little things here like, oh, you want to make sure that your heart's right with God, otherwise you're not going to get to heaven. And I remember being reprimanded once or twice by children saying that that's not okay to force your beliefs onto other people. And from that point on, I just switched into kid mode when I got to school. I switched into, I'm not home. I don't have to be talking about these things. I'm just going to talk about boys and choir and coloring and figure out why my teachers are mad at me that I don't know certain academics and
Yeah.
get around that apparently.
Yeah, that's right. You had been homeschooled up until this point. Yeah, were you super behind, or had your parents kept up with the right grade of study?
I would say I was extremely behind. I'm still super behind, but at 7th grade, when I went to 7th grade, I would say I was about a 2nd grade level as far as reading, and I knew addition, but other than reading and addition, that's all I really knew. I knew the basic concept of multiplication, but I really had to step it up when it came to my classes. And I don't think that they told my teachers or anything because it just seemed like the teachers were pretty upset with me, or I think they thought that I was joking. I was a very jokey kind of kid. And so they might have just chalked that up to, oh, this kid's just messing with us. Let's just continue the lesson.
Oh, like for not knowing certain things in
Yeah.
history or math or
Like they would be knee deep in their long division thing, and I would ask them, "Oh, but how do you multiply?" And then a bunch of kids would laugh, and so I would laugh thinking that it was a funny thing, and then the teacher was just like, "Oh, okay, stop making jokes. We got to get back to the lesson here."
wow.
So I didn't even know how to ask for help really.
So how did you end up doing? I mean, did you stay in school and graduate? What ended up happening from that point?
My parents didn't like how many questions I was asking being in school for the first time, and so they pulled me out for a year, and I was just miserable for my 8th grade. I was so depressed. I didn't have my friends, and I had made all these connections with people that were my age for the first time that I begged them and I begged them all summer, and they finally let me go to high school with all my friends. So that would be freshman and sophomore year, and I did that. And I realized after going through a bunch of high school drama and still struggling academically, I couldn't do both. And I decided for myself to pull myself out junior and senior year, and I ended up just doing my schooling all by myself on the computer.
Hmm.
And I did end up graduating, so that's cool.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
And obviously, you at this point you question your parents' beliefs. So, do you remember any turning point where you were like, "This doesn't seem right"? Like, did it happen in high school? Did it happen after you graduated? Like, was there anything that stands out?
I think it happened around 16, probably. We went through the 2012 event and nothing happened. And dad said it was going to happen somewhere when I turned 18 or 19. And so the rest of that timeline was spent towards making sure I had the things I wanted on earth before God took us away. And so I definitely still kept into that theology for a while, but I started to see as I brought friends home, as I brought questions home that their own theology, the actual teachings of the Bible and what God wants us to do with our lives, didn't match up with their end of the world things, I guess. So one of the first things that made me question this, or at least contradicted themselves, was the love is patient, love is kind verse. You probably know that.
Yes.
That one, when I read that for the first time, I remember thinking about my family and about my teachings, and it says, God loves us. My parents say they love us, but they're irritable, they're resentful, they're arrogant and rude, and they're contradicting that whole verse. And I remember bringing that verse to my dad and being like, do you believe this? Is this true? Is this what love is? And he's like, yes, isn't it great? This is the love that God has for us. And he didn't know in that moment that I was asking, is this what you think love is? And if it is, why aren't you practicing these things? And because they weren't practicing love the way they said it should be defined, it made me think, okay, if they're saying one thing but doing another, what about for the end of the world? Should I even be putting this time and energy and I, because you're a teenager, I'm a teenager at that point, I just had a million questions going in my head. I really started to think deeper on a more psychological level, I would say, because up until 15, it was all no choice at all. That's just how it was. And now I'm at the point where I do feel like I can start asking questions, and this verse specifically got to me because they aren't loving. What they're teaching is not loving. It's exclusive and it's hurtful.
I mean, the teaching that the world's going to end and you guys are going to be saved, but other people are not.
Right. And
Okay.
don't try to make friends. Don't try to help anybody else. It's just us. And that line of thinking, it didn't line up with the love verse.
And did you ever talk about any of this with any of your friends from high school, or had you just kind of learned to not say anything?
The few friends who were able to come to my house, they knew that my mom had some psychotic tendencies, and anybody who meets her can kind of tell there's something going on there, but that was embarrassing enough in and of itself, so I didn't feel the need to just add more shame to me. I don't think any of them know about it to this day.
Oh, wow. Okay. At what point did you actually leave the house? Was it when you turned 18 or?
Yeah, I almost left at 16 because my mom and I just started really not getting along, and then I knew that it was going to be a huge challenge for me to try and make it on my own at that age, so I grit my teeth for 2 more years, and that was about the timeline that I realized the world probably isn't ending. This is probably all bullshit, and I need to figure out what I got to do for the rest of my life. And so I worked and I worked and I worked as much as I could, and I saved as much money as I could, and then I got a car and I moved out a couple days after my 18th birthday, and they never questioned it and I never went back. They
Wow.
had all the other kids to worry about, plus my youngest brother with his health difficulties. I feel like it was a pretty easy transition to leave just because they didn't feel the need to control me anymore, and that they knew that they couldn't.
And because they had all your other siblings there and were pretty distracted,
Right.
sounds like. So did you move far away, or how far away did you go?
I moved down the road. I could probably drive to their house in 10 minutes, so yeah, not too far away. And that lasted for a year, and I ended up meeting my husband during that time, and we moved in together a year and a half later. So now I'm about a city away, so I could get there in about 45 minutes.
So you're still close.
Still close, but far enough.
Once you first left, did you stay in contact with your parents and siblings? I mean, it sounds like you were physically pretty close, but did you visit and talk to them, or did you kind of have a clean break?
um I did try to go back and talk because I was the third parent, and I felt like I was leaving my children. So I I went back a lot because I wanted to see them and I wanted to check up on them and make sure that they were okay. And along with all of this, there was some physical abuses as well, and so I wanted to make sure that they were safe and knew that they could come and visit me or come sleep over at my house if they needed to. But I knew that I had to keep a relationship with my parents so that I had the opportunity to do that. Because if I had just left in a way that was F you and I'm done with you guys and you hurt me beyond repair, then I know I wouldn't be able to come back and see that
Yeah.
and make sure that they were okay. So, no, I've kept it pretty open for a long time, and it wasn't honestly until this last year that I finally started diving deep into the hurt and the pain and why things happened the way that they did and how it affected me and why it's wrong. And I've tried to bring a couple of those things up, but mainly just now that all the kids are about almost 18 and up at this point, they're all pretty close to self-independent, and I know that if I were to bring these up now, it's a safe point to do so because it's not going to destroy the lives of my siblings in the process.
Are they all still at home?
There's 2 at home right now, not including the youngest brother. He's going to be there forever, and that's a whole different can of worms. But they're all almost self-sufficient at this point.
What is your life like now? You mentioned you got married.
I did, yeah. I got married last year to a wonderful
Congratulations.
man. Thank you. We actually met right before I moved out, and he got to see some of that. But we met at a church, and we both ended up leaving the church, and we got married, and now we're here. And then my sister got kicked out of the house, so she's living with us now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, good stuff. But it wasn't until I was about 18 that I realized that this is my life, and I have control and autonomy over it, and I'm gonna go make it what I want. I just got away, and I would text every once in a while or visit, but those next 2 years were figuring out not only what I wanted to do, but what I could do without these holes in my education, these holes in my medical history, this lack of experience in the world. How am I going to move through this in a way that is proactive to my life and not destructive? I was talking to my husband the other day about this too, and asking him because he got to see some of my personality at that point and what it was to find myself and how I looked to the outside world. And I was very susceptible to anybody and everything. I wanted the whole world at once because I had never experienced it. So finally being free and seeing it for what it was, I wanted every experience. I wanted every friend. I wanted every job. I wanted and the problem is what comes into that is the slimy people, the untrustworthy people, the predators out there. I was susceptible to all of it, and that caused a lot of my own pain that I caused it myself because I wasn't careful enough. So what really helped me was the friendships I made, my siblings, my best friends, my husband, these people that could be in my life that told me to be careful and warned me of my susceptibility and how that was affecting my life. And yes, my willingness to go and experience the world and be in it and make memories. That was a good thing. There's nothing wrong with that. I just find it very ironic because my parents caused this huge battle that I will be battling for the rest of my life. And the whole time they're telling me not to make friends. And lo and behold, it's the friendships that I have made. It's the people that I have met since then that have really helped me to succeed in my life and have the strength and stability to really find myself and my place in the world.
Yeah.
And the irony in that is almost poetic.
Yeah. Do you still see them? Do you still see your parents at all?
We were for a while. And like I said, now that, especially since the pandemic, because that kind of brought back all of the end of the world things.
Oh, yeah, we definitely need to talk about that.
We do. To answer your question shortly, no, I do not talk to them very often. My dad and I keep open communication because he's at least a little bit more mentally centered. But as the years have gone on, my mother is showing early signs of dementia, and she has gone into psychosis a few times. And yeah, I think it's a lot more of it's a little hairy on that side. But I do talk to my dad through text every once in a while, but otherwise it's pretty silent.
Let's talk about the pandemic. How much of an effect did the pandemic have on your parents? What with, I guess, every aspect, the having to quarantine, the vaccines, did that prove something to your parents or did it cause them to question? Like, what was their relationship with this whole situation we've been dealing with for years now?
Right. Okay, so going through the timeline, 2012 didn't happen. They said maybe around 2014, 2016, didn't happen again. And you could tell that they were starting to fizzle off on their beliefs. They still practiced the Christian religion, they still loved God and taught to their children. But as far as the end of the world stuff, that you could tell that they were either ashamed or embarrassed or just keeping it to themselves at that point. And it wasn't until, gosh, what was it was the beginning of 2020 the pandemic started, right?
Yeah, like March 2020.
March. Yeah.
Or
So
at least, or
around
at least it started, but that's when I remember things like getting real. Like you couldn't go anywhere. Like
right.
March is what stands
Right.
out.
So you know that during that time there was different phases of people. There were the people that took it seriously right away and quarantined and took the CDC's recommendations, and then there were the stragglers, and then there were the people that were just full on against it. This is the government trying to control us. That was the group that my parents were a part of.
Hmm. Okay.
And now being in a time where everything on the internet is accessible at the touch of your fingers, as opposed to back in 2012, that wasn't so much the case for my family. My parents went on this deep dive rabbit hole of links and articles and videos and sent them all out to the kids and myself. And you could tell that they were excited to, not excited for the pandemic, but you could tell that they were excited to be back into their, see, end of the world, it's happening, we told you, right, it's coming.
So the pandemic was like a sign that the end of the world was coming.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Huh.
And I don't know actual verses, but I remember my dad talking about how the world's going to start to go crazy and fall apart, and a third of the world is going to die before Jesus comes back from some disaster, either a natural disaster or something. And he thought that COVID was that disaster. Okay, now when this is over and a third of the world dies, God's going to take the rest of the believers to heaven with us. So they still, to this day, believe that when the pandemic is over and when this wave is done, that's what's going to happen.
Okay. So it kind of in some way I don't know, refreshed. I'm trying to think of the right word to
Yeah,
describe, like refreshed,
revitalized that
revitalized.
belief.
That's it. Revitalized
Yeah.
their beliefs. And you said they got really into some online stuff. Did they spend a lot of time on YouTube or like certain websites?
Yes, it was YouTube for a while, but my mom kept complaining that because YouTube is good about their misinformation thing and, staying on top of that, she kept sending us links, and then she'd be like, "Darn it, YouTube keeps deleting these things because they're calling it misinformation." And so
Mm,
she ended up finding her own little avenues, places where misinformation, that was the point of the website. I showed you a couple. The Highwire was one of them.
yeah. And that all seemed to have a lot to do with anti-vaccine stuff.
Yes, and I think that's what my mom latched onto, was the vaccine part of it.
Okay.
Because again, I think it was partly the internet, but their belief that they've had for so long is revitalizing in this pandemic. But the group that they are a part of was mainly focused on vaccines. And so I think that that is why they really dove into that, is because all these people who agree with them that the end of the world's going to happen and the government's trying to control us, those people's main focus was the vaccine and being against that. I think that's why that they took that and ran with it, was because the rest of their group that they identified with was.
Was it something with the vaccine? Like through the vaccine, the government was trying to control people, or did they just see the control as like government mandated vaccine?
Both, and because
Okay.
I remember getting some links where my mom said that the vaccine itself would have little tiny robots in it, and they were going to control your body or scan your brain. And, even saying it out loud, I'm just scoffing at myself. I know, I know. But then, actually forcing the vaccine on people itself, that act was also stigmatized by my mom and dad about, the control of the government. So it was a both and situation for sure.
So I assume they have not gotten vaccinated. I'm sure that's
No,
yeah.
no. In fact, if I might expand on that a little bit,
Please.
my sister, the one right below me, she is full on diving into the opposite side of what our parents believe. She was probably the black sheep of the family, I would say, or at least she definitely classifies herself as that. And so I think that really drove her to go the opposite side of what my parents did. So she's getting all her vaccines, she's getting checkups and diving into that world. And my mom had found out she took the vaccine, and this is part of what caused a schism in our family recently. Was she wasn't allowed to be around my younger brother. She
Oh,
wasn't allowed to come to family gatherings anymore because there's some article out there that she sent us that said that people who take the vaccine have a month shedding period or something where the vaccine will actually shed onto other people and that will cause them to die. And
wow.
so she was pretty much excommunicated from the family at that point, but all of the siblings are enraged by this. So this has caused a huge schism, and the recent non-communication between each other has been because of this vaccine debate.
Okay. And so, if you don't mind me asking, where do you fall? I guess I'm just wondering about your belief systems now. Are you suspicious of the vaccine? Are you cool with it?
It's really hard for me to trust anybody or anything now at this point. So I don't trust my parents, but I don't trust the world either. I don't trust the medical system. And it's not because of anything that my parents said. I feel embarrassed saying this only because I know how people are painted. Like my parents, I know how those people are painted to the rest of the world. And I feel bad not having really a belief on that. I'm more just watching it happen and saying that I don't have a side. I'm just looking at both sides going, wow, both sides have their own beliefs and they're both strong. And I don't know, I guess I just because I don't trust anybody, I won't pick anything. So
Mm.
I'm just here.
Yeah, so you're still figuring things out, and you're still pretty young,
Yes.
right?
I'll be 25 this month.
Okay, that's cool.
Absolutely.
That's what you gotta
Beginning.
do. That's what
Beginning
you
of
gotta
my
do.
life.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing your story. If you don't mind sticking around for a little bit,
Yeah.
I'd like to move into a short discussion and bring Ashlyn back in.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, one of the many things I found interesting about your experience is how, especially the last part, how timely and topical it is. You know, the pandemic has kind of been this driving force in our life for the last couple of years, and it sounded like
Yeah.
it affected your family even more with concerns over the pandemic and also the prevalence of conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
So I was hoping we could have a little chat about that.
Yeah, for sure.
So, Ashlyn,
Hi, I certainly have some commentary and questions.
Oh,
great.
perfect.
And I feel like so many people will be able to relate to your stories, not only with like the conspiracy stuff, but also when it comes to maintaining relationships with family members.
Mm.
I mean, the fact that you remain in contact so that you can see your siblings, that's something that's extremely difficult, but a lot of people have experienced that. And I think that it shows how much love and care that you had for your siblings. And I absolutely love that.
Oh,
That's a very common experience, and yet it's a very difficult thing
right.
to, feel that fear of being further disconnected from your siblings. So
Mm.
I'm happy to hear that you've been a safe landing place for one of them currently who's living with you.
Yeah.
Um,
I'm glad too.
yeah. And then when it comes to conspiracy theories, cults are known for black and white thinking.
Mm.
And even certain churches, which can be abusive, are very like black and white thinking. There's no room for conflicting statements, for nuance. I feel like this field has opened up the possibilities of two things existing at the same time.
Mm.
So, what I mean by that is, you mentioned when you first started out talking about your story, how it was almost like a movie. There was
Yeah.
beautiful aspects to it. And yet there was also this sort of sinister undertones of like the end
Yeah.
times. And two can exist simultaneously.
Mm.
We could have very joyous experiences in groups. We could have very almost like these sort of romanticized feelings from our childhood, even if the greater context isn't necessarily healthy. Both of those things can't exist. And so I just want you to feel validated in feeling like it's okay to hold on to what you loved about your childhood.
Mm.
And it's okay to shed things that you didn't love so much about your childhood. And you're right now, you're on sort of this path to more self discovery, which is really inspiring. So it's okay to kind of feel that like nuance, that conflict within yourself. And I would probably say that the same thing is true when it comes to your parents. of course, there was abuse, there was damage done because of this end times thinking. I mean, even when it came to conspiracy theories, there was medical neglect. And unfortunately, medical neglect is a very common theme within cultic
Yeah.
groups. I'm also someone who my parents have actually changed their perspectives quite a bit over the years, but I'm someone who was also raised anti-vax, and so I am in the process of catching up on my vaccinations as well. And medical neglect is horrible. The lengths that your parents went to ensure that their children were prepared so that you could all spend eternity together forever. From their perspective, that was like their greatest way to show you love, probably.
Yeah.
And so that, to me, as you were telling me your story and the lengths they went to, really resonated with, like, I could feel the love that your parents had for you. However, that doesn't mean that it wasn't right. You know, the ways in which they went about doing that
Right.
were in your best interests. That doesn't mean that they are justified in handling and doing the things that they did. But from their perspective, it certainly was like they were doing these things out of love. So I just wanted to point out that this topic and this conversation, there can be
Both and.
like two sides to this. Yes, both and. Yeah, exactly. And it's complicated when it comes to recovery from these types of situations, right?
Yes.
Because not all of it was bad, even if most of it was, or and so it's hard to kind of reconcile these things. It's a really important conversation. You know, when it comes to kind of coming back to conspiracy theories, because, you know, Deanna mentioned conspiracy theories. I think the danger of conspiracy theories and online accessibility in this current modern age is that community within these destructive systems and influences has never been more accessible.
Yes.
And
Yeah,
you
absolutely.
can live so isolated and still have the ability to, you know, like, let's say you can't sleep, get out of bed. It's 2 in the morning. No one may be living around you, but you know where you can find community is in these chat forums. You know,
Yes.
people who are there to affirm your beliefs, these sort of very insular places. And I don't know if your parents, you know, were QAnon adherents or followers.
Mm.
It sounds like they certainly were in some of these spaces with some of the beliefs I'm
Yes.
hearing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Even if they didn't call themselves, you know, QAnon people, like they
Right.
certainly, what I'm hearing sounds, you know, very integrated in that. But
Absolutely.
that sort of accessibility factor is what makes it so dangerous. You know, with some groups, it's like you go to a meeting house, you go to a church, you go to a, you know, a party, whatever, and then you go home. There's a little bit of separation.
Yes.
But with conspiracy theories, it is very integrated into the home and it can really affect the whole family system and trickle down in affecting everyone involved. I just wanted to mention that.
You're making me think too, part of that as well is you can find the answer you want to anything on the internet.
Mhm.
Right.
Whatever you search for, and I remember bringing that up to them, and that is something that I think anybody wanting control in those kind of situations, they can back it up with anything because no matter where they go, as long as they type it into Google, like, is water bad for you? Is water good for you? Whichever one you end up searching, you're gonna get that answer whether it's right or not.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No, that's so
exactly.
true. Like people can, instead of starting with the question, people can basically start with the answer that they want and
Yes,
move
and work
backwards
their
from
way
there.
back.
And unfortunately, that's one of the downsides to us having access to so much information these days.
We have access to so much misinformation as well.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
much. Yeah, so much. And of course, you're not the only person I've heard from, and I'm sure Deanna can attest to as well,
Mm.
that the pandemic has caused people to dive back into that belief
Yeah.
system. And that is very, very common. It just, when it came to sort of like your parents' ability to cope, is kind of what I keep coming back to. When the pandemic's caused them to dive deeper back into their belief system, your mom has had, you know, some psychotic episodes when, you know, the ability to cope with their children,
Mm.
having little to no control over their children as they get older,
Yes.
can almost create their, you know, when they put their comfort in these conspiracy theories and turn inwards, it really creates this sort of false comfort for themselves trying to
Yes.
navigate.
That's well put, thank you.
Yeah. I also wanted to get to when it comes to labels, you know, how you were mentioning how labels can be helpful. Sometimes we don't know how to best label our experiences. Another very common theme.
Yeah, I mean, I still struggle with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Deanna and I, we did a whole episode on this season on just talking about what the word cult means.
Yeah.
And that's how long did we talk about that for, Deanna? I mean, that was like
I don't
a
know.
long
Recorded
conversation.
or unrecorded. Yeah, we've
Yeah.
had lots of conversations not recorded too.
Yeah, yeah, it's true. I mean, that's the term cult itself is a very long, it could be a long thing to sort of unpack.
Right.
I think that labels can be really helpful, but not necessarily for everyone. But when you were describing your experience, how, you know, I found it really interesting that when it came to your parents, it wasn't necessarily like a church. I mean, there was like the praise church, you know, that, you know, may have been fueling some of these ideas, but
Mm.
what was interesting was your parents were almost feeding off of each other, from
Yes.
what I was understanding.
Yes.
And you mentioned that your grandmother passed it along, some of these ideas to your father, who maybe even has helped fuel some of your mother's ideas. But what's so interesting about this is I would consider you someone who fits in the category of being a MGA. And I don't know if you've ever heard of that term.
No.
It's a multi generational adult former member.
Mm.
Some people like to say former cult member. I just say former member because sometimes the word cult is helpful, sometimes it's not.
Right.
But in a nutshell, you had very multi generational influence involved in your story because we're dealing with a family unit. And what that means is when it comes to recovery, there are certain resources for those who were born or raised in groups that may be more so helpful, or there's a whole support network. There's people who have been born or raised in these groups. And Dr. Jill Abby Mitten has coined the term multi-generational adult. I'm also someone in that category where the influence of these ideas have been multi-generations in the making.
Yeah.
And that poses very unique recovery challenges for people like you and I who break that mold, who go outside that. I mean, we're disrupting family systems with our exiting. And so when we do exit, like you mentioned, your sister, who has kind of been seen as the black sheep, how an action, which can be seen as very common, such as getting a vaccine,
Mm-hmm.
you could see the disruption that that further caused,
Yes.
you know, in your family. And it really attests to how multi-generational some of these ideas are,
Mm.
and how I guess like how bold of a move someone like you or your siblings are making
Yeah.
in going against generational influences. So I don't know if that'd be a helpful label for you, multi-generational. It's called an MGA,
MGA.
but
No, that is
yeah,
helpful. Thank you.
you certainly fit within that category, you know?
No, it's nice to have a name for it.
Yeah, because your recovery is very different than someone who may have, you know, aligned themselves with a group when they were 35. They had a pre cult self. They're able to look back in their life and say, oh, I miss the parts of me that I used to be before the cult. And they're
Mm.
able to kind of discern and pick and choose what they want their life to look like moving forward. But people like yourself, you don't really have a starting place. You know, this was your life.
So I have to find that now. Yeah.
Yeah. So when it comes to the struggles of identity, that's something that is certainly could be more of a struggle for someone who's born or raised. Not always, but could be.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, I went to the Praise House site as you two were talking, just to kind of get clarity to see if some of these like ideas were involved about like the
The
end
end of the
time.
world ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. And
yeah.
it's definitely from the perspective, just from what I could tell on their website, we're dealing with, you know, these ideas surrounding the millennium. And there's so much material on the millennium. It essentially comes down to Revelation chapter 20 that there's a lot there. Basically, there's 1,000-year reign. And that's something that was on the Praise House website. But what's interesting is some cults have adopted this sort of millenarian mindset to take extreme measures to ensure survival until Christ returns.
Mm.
And groups like this can view themselves as sort of the last remaining outpost, you know, of like the true religion in
Right.
an increasingly hostile world. And so the millennium is something that can certainly fuel this sorts of thinking. And I notice even within this group's website, they subscribe to the millennium, and you never know how much that could have been a fixation point or an influence in your
Right.
parents' perspectives. So I just thought that that was really
Yeah,
interesting.
it is really interesting.
Ashlyn, did what you grow up in? Did that have any kind of end times aspect to it?
Yeah, it was end times, but it was very different. It wasn't like a rapture thing. We came from very Anabaptist type language, and I can't remember if we were categorized as dispensationalists, but it was a different end of the spectrum.
Mm.
Like we certainly believed in end times, but we didn't believe in a literal 1,000-year reign on earth that Christ would do. There's some beliefs that believe that, and that's fine, but what that can fuel is this sort of hyperfixation on ensuring these survival skills,
Yeah.
because they truly see themselves as like the last stop on the way to Armageddon,
Yeah.
and so some groups can take that to the extreme.
I have a question for both of you guys about survival skills because I did not come from a Bible based group. I came from kind of more of an Eastern based,
Yeah.
New
Mm.
Agey, and I didn't have any of that, any of the end times. So I get confused when people talk about survival skills because if the world is going to end, why do you need survival skills?
Because of the 1,000-year reign. So typically groups, Bible-based groups that, consider having these survival skills necessary, these more doomsday groups, believe in this sort of Christ will come back to earth for 1,000-year reign, and those who were sinful will be snatched, and there's this hell component. But basically there's chaos before the peace. From what
Yes.
I understand, is there's chaos first before this sort of 1,000-year reign period. Am I correct in any of that,
That's what was
Emily?
that was definitely what was put into us. The day that we
Okay.
took all our survival packs and we went to the park to wait for whatever was going to happen in the sky. The reason we
Yeah.
took our survival packs because we weren't going to be taken at that moment. We were going to see
Right.
what God was going to do and where we needed to go based off of that.
Right. It's not a smooth process, this sort of second coming.
Yes.
Especially from the
Mm.
millennium.
Millennium.
I can't even say it. I've said it too many times.
Yeah.
It's just becoming a tongue
It's
twister.
not a word
You guys
anymore.
know what I mean.
Yeah.
The 1,000-year reign.
Mhm.
It's not a smooth transition by any means. It is very
Right.
disruptive. This sort of changing of the guard, if you want to think of it that way.
Yes, that's a great way to label that actually.
Yeah.
Okay, so while you're waiting for the good things to happen, there's this chaos
Chaos.
period where
Yeah.
you have to take care of yourself and survive.
Chaos. Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah, there's a rapture involved. There's chaos.
My parents also kind of labeled or not labeled it, but painted it as like a test almost from God.
Yeah.
Oh, like if you can survive during this chaos period.
Yeah, in a way, that was kind of how they painted it for sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
So all this to say, some of these observations and commentary, all this to say, a lot of the themes that you've been discussing, Emily, are so common
Mm.
within many other people's experiences who've either been involved in like doomsday type groups or who've had family members involved in conspiracy thinking. And oftentimes those categories can overlap.
Yeah.
And there was good and bad both involved in your experience and probably other siblings' experience as well. And so these things can be kind of messy to sort of unpack.
Mm.
But I'm grateful that you have begun unpacking these things and sharing with us. You know the term nothing's new under the sun? Have
Yeah.
you ever heard of that? Yeah. I find the longer that I'm in this field, hearing people's stories and, learning more about these sorts of ideologies is they're typically, just different variations of past theologies or ideologies, just sort of repackaged
Right.
and made the one true thing. So there is truly nothing new under the sun, is how it feels sometimes in
Right.
this field. Yeah. So your scene and your experience, I just want to thank you again for sharing.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the space to do so. And it is comforting to know that I'm not alone, but it's still a process giving up to that in a way because it's ironic because the teaching we were grown up in is we are standalone from the rest of the world.
Right.
We are different from everybody else. And so getting away from that, it's helpful for that, but it's also, it makes it very, I don't know, like I need to look inward more and question more and
Well, and that's a very isolating place to be in.
yeah.
I mean, you could be I grew up in a very non-isolated group, and yet we also subscribe to that same belief that we're the true church sort of thing,
Mhm.
and that could be a very isolating experience.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for this discussion. Emily, thank you for trusting us with your story and for all your time.
I really appreciate both of your time, and it's been very therapeutic to really get these ideas and this conversation going. So I really appreciate you both.
Of course. Of course. Thank you again, Emily.
Thank you for listening to Generation Cult, and we hope you enjoyed this episode. Next time on the show, I'll be speaking with someone who somewhat recently left with his whole family a group called the 12 Tribes. A more in-depth podcast out of Australia focusing on the 12 tribes, called Inside the Tribe, in which our guest also appears on, is now airing new episodes. Generation Cult is hosted and produced by me, Dhyana Levy, with co-hosting by Ashlen Hilliard, original music by Leanne Dunn, and theme music by The Chaw.